This is the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast, episode number 38. When the subject of philosophy comes up in relation to ontology practice, it's typically cited as the origin of the term, and then the subject is dropped. Hart sees many other connections between ontology practice and its philosophical roots. In addition to logic as the foundation of OWL, he shows how philosophy concepts like epistemology, metaphysics, and rhetoric are relevant to both knowledge graphs and AI technology in general.
Welcome to the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast, where experts on knowledge graphs and the semantic web share their wisdom with the digital and business communities. Our mission is to demystify and democratize knowledge graph technology and practices to make the benefits of knowledge graphs and semantic technology accessible to all. And now, here's your host, Larry Swanson.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode number 38 of the Knowledge Graph Insights podcast. I am really delighted today to welcome to the show Hart. Casey has a really cool YouTube channel on the philosophy behind ontology engineering and ontology practice. Casey's currently an ontologist at Ford, the motor car company. So welcome, Casey. Tell the folks a little bit more about what you're up to these days.
Hi, thanks, Larry. I'm super excited to be here. I've listened to the podcast, and man, your intros sound so smooth. I was like, I wonder how many edits that takes. No, you just fire them off. That's beautiful. Yeah. So, like you said, these days I'm the ontologist at Ford. So, building out data models for sensor data and vehicle information, and all those sorts of fun things. I'm also working as a consultant. I've got a couple of different startup healthcare companies and some cybersecurity stuff, little things around the edge. I love evangelizing ontology, talking about it and thinking about it. And as you mentioned for the YouTube channel, that's been sort of my creative outlet. My background is in philosophy, and I was interested in, I got my PhD in philosophy. I was going to teach it. You write lots of papers, those sorts of things, and I missed that to some extent getting out into industry, and that's kind of been my way back into, all right, come up with an idea, try and distill it, think about objections, put it together, and so I'm really enjoying that lately. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm enjoying the videos. Yeah, no, I really appreciate what you're doing there. One thing I wanted to, and I love that you're like that's how you're getting back to both your philosophical roots, but also a part of it is to evangelize ontology practice, that's what this podcast is all about, like democratizing and sharing practice. But I think and I just love that you have this explicit and strong philosophical foundation and bent to how you talk about things. And I think a lot of times that conversation is like, yeah, ontology comes out of philosophy, and that's the end of the conversation. But you've mentioned like the role of metaphysics, epistemology, logic, all of which. Can you talk a little bit about how those, beyond just I think a lot of people think about logic and OWL and all that stuff. But can you talk a little bit more about the role of metaphysics and epistemology and these other philosophical ideas?
Yeah, definitely. So you sort of mentioned this in the pre-notes, like here's a topic we'd like to get to, and I got into a lot of imposter syndrome on this, right? Where as a I'm trying to talk myself out of this, but I think most ontologists have this feel like there's no solid, easy pipeline into becoming an ontologist, right? It's a very eclectic group of us. My background's in philosophy. You run into a bunch of librarians. You've got computer scientists who do DB administration. You've got jazz musicians I've run into. It's a weird group. I say that just to be in sometimes when I get asked about, okay, how does ontological practice work? I think, well, I didn't actually train to be an ontologist. I kind of fell into it, so I'm ill-equipped to say things about what role ontology or philosophy plays in ontology. I just know I learned philosophy, and then I'm using some of those tools here. So there's like two different answers. One is sort of historically, how does philosophy inform and shape the nature of ontology practice? And the other part is just, okay, if you've got a philosophical toolkit, right, of metaphysics and epistemology and logic, how does that apply and make you a better ontologist? I mean, the obvious connection is that ontology is a philosophical term. It comes from metaphysics, right? We look back to Aristotle, and it's the study of that which exists. So do we want to say there's, fundamentally fire, air, earth, water, or something like that, right? Or fundamentally there are these atoms, and those are the sorts of things that are part of the inventory of reality, right? It's not physics, it's metaphysics. It's the thing that, and I think for Aristotle, it's just like, it's the book that sits next to his physics, right? In all of his category or in his library of everything. But when we move that forward to computer science and data modeling, then we're thinking, okay, maybe not for all of reality, although maybe it depends on how big you want your data model to be. But if I'm a retailer, what are the terms and ontology, like what are the terms that I care about, the things that I need to model, the constituents of reality that matter to me? And that might be types of, if you're Amazon, it's okay, medium-sized dry goods versus sporting equipment versus something else. If I'm doing a medical ontology, it's patients and payers and providers, et cetera. So in philosophy, in ontology, we think about, this is a bunch of different tools and examples, right? But we think about, okay, what are some fundamental distinctions that we want to make? How can we carve nature at its joints in like really sensible way? That's a phrase that you'll hear a lot. We could say more about it if you want. But what I found is being a philosopher who goes into an ontology space is that I have this like inventory of examples from all of my grad seminars and various things that I'm looking through and going through, like whether I want to talk about Gavagai and undetached rabbit parts, if that makes sense to anybody, or whether I want to talk about GRU as a color. Like, here are some like examples, ways that we could chop up the world in unnatural ways versus chopping it up in natural ways, and how do we make those distinctions? And that applies straightforwardly when you get into building an ontology model for an oil and gas industry or something like that. There's a bunch of ways that we can divvy up all the things you care about. What's the right and sensible way to do it? So I guess that's the metaphysics ontology way. Logic, you mentioned, right? We need to think about reasoning. I don't just want to assert a bunch of things about my data. A fundamental premise of an ontology is that we want to understand our data. We want to confer meaning on it. And that means that we have to be able to leverage the structure of the ontology to infer things smartly, right? So simple things like set containment are fine, right? If all persons are animals, right? And then we say something about animals like they're spatiotemporal creatures. Then when I say that persons are a subclass of that, then I get for free that persons are spatiotemporal things as well, right? But we get a lot more complicated inferences as we go. We have to think about statistical reasoning. So just in general, if logic is the study of what makes for good arguments, what follows from what, right? That's obviously got a lot of applications in ontology, AI. And then the third piece, right, that we talked about is epistemology. Epistemology is the study of knowledge and belief. Roughly about what it means to be justified. So the classic example there is, if I know something, what exactly does that amount to? And then Plato says it's justified true beliefs. And then the history of epistemology is littered with examples of trying to cash out exactly what does it mean to be justified. And if you get new information, how can that undercut your justifications? How do you update your beliefs? More recent stuff, and this is what I did in my dissertation, Bayesian epistemology, so doing probabilistic reasoning. So instead of just what do you believe, what degrees of belief do you have towards something? So it might not be that I believe or disbelieve that a vaccine will prevent me from getting the flu this year, but maybe I have a credence of 0.2 that will prevent me from getting the flu this year. And then we get new information that says that there's two flu strains out there that we didn't expect, and so now my credence is maybe lowered from 0.2 to some other number. How do we address that, right? And when I'm building an ontology model, I should be thinking about this stuff too. What are the things out there? What things am I asserting are true in my model? How do I think probabilistically about stuff? How do we represent probabilistic knowledge, which is super tricky in OWL? That maybe is too much into the weeds and would take us more than the 30 minutes just to talk.
No, but it also might be, and we can say this for later, it might be a pathway into the AI stuff. The probabilistic, I don't know if there's some intersection there of those ideas. But as you were just talking just now, you reminded me, I heard I think it might have been Walid Saba years ago say that like one of the problems with the semantic web is that it was Boolean. And your research was on Bayesian, and then you just talked just now about probabilistic and sort of degrees of belief and stuff. is there, how much is epistemology the thing that gives us the tool to deal with fuzziness in ontology practice?
So, I mean, part of what they study in epistemology does get to that. Uh, you can maybe uh, smooth out the transit. So, yeah, if triples fundamentally feel more Boolean, right? You just say, subject, predicate, object, and you're just asserting that thing to be true, right? Um, but we can pack probabilities into that kind of structure too, right? Where we can use things like, if we want to say RDF star or something like that, like we can say of this statement that it has a degree of probability 0.7. You can also use data type properties. We can use lists. There's ways to inject numbers into this, and the same problem comes up in in epistemology and Bayesian epistemology. Is the discussion like we call them credences, right? So if I say I have a degree of belief of 0.7, that's a credence, or at least that's the way that's talked about in the literature. And there's some people that say, that's kind of lame. That's just more ways of talking about belief. So to say that I believe that it's going to rain tomorrow, okay, there's a Boolean sentence, right? It's just either I believe or I don't believe it, or maybe withhold belief. Maybe it's 3 values. If I say that I have a credence that it's going to rain tomorrow of 0.7, maybe that's just the same thing as saying I believe there's a 70% chance of rain tomorrow, right? And now we're just back into a straightforward belief claim, and we don't need to make any hay about talking about credences. You can probably do a lot of the same things when we're you can put numbers into this more Boolean feeling OWL RDF model. Yeah, it's something I have to think about more. I would say in general, just getting some of the Boolean stuff to work pretty well is hard and valuable enough that that's usually my first pass is like let's get that stuff in there. And then if we want to get more nuanced about saying, okay, now I have X degree of confidence in this source that statement came from, so I'm going to interpret it as, we can do competing arguments. There were some really fun things that we did with that back at Psychor, where it was just adding metadata to each assertion, right? So if you have the provenance of each claim, then you state all these claims in maybe a more or less Boolean way, but when you want to weigh them against each other, some of them might be more forceful than another, right? You just imagine it's like you have two experts that are telling you contradictory things, and then you have to decide which expert do I think is more reliable on this topic.
Right. That's where it gets really fun. Was the mechanism for that annotations about the about the assertion about the likelihood of its?
Yeah, essentially. I mean, at Psychor, it was it wasn't an OWL RDF, it was in Psych, which is sort of a Lispy derived version, and so it wasn't quite the same. But yeah, essentially using annotation properties or something like that, or
And, if you could talk just a little bit about the Psych project, because I think a lot of people newer to this may not be aware of it. I think it's pretty important and foundational. In fact, Doug Lynette was posthumously awarded an award at KGC last year. Can you talk just a little bit about the Psych project and what you did at Psychor?
Yeah, sure. So without Doug Lynette and Psychor, I would not be an ontologist. That's for sure. I mean, my history with that was back when I was getting my master's in Wyoming. I remember talking to one of my mentor professors there, and just like in passing, we were like, all right, I'm looking forward to this. I'm good at this. I'm going to be a professor someday. Like, heck, what else would you do with a philosophy degree? And he was like, I had this one guy, friend of mine long ago, who showed me his business card after he got a job out of grad school, and it said ontological engineer. And we laughed about that, like what a silly job title that would be. Some foreshadowing for my life. And then when I got on the job market for philosophy, Psych had a posting because Psychor wanted philosophy PhDs. They sort of saw this as like a market inefficiency. These are smart people who can think symbolically and put stuff down. Maybe he also had an understanding that humanities grads would take way less money than people who are already in the tech field, which is a little money ball of the situation. And the Psych project was all about, so it was formalizing and symbolizing things, but it started with, I think of it as its big differentiator is like common sense reasoning, where the thought was, okay, great, there's a whole bunch of things we want to do with AI, and that's wonderful. Machine learning, that's going to be super cool. That's going to do some great stuff. But fundamentally, to think about the world, you need to know basic facts about how reality is structured. Bigger things don't fit inside of smaller things, right? Heavier objects are harder to carry than lighter objects. When I say the bee landed on the flower, I need to have a model of reality that helps me interpret what that sentence means. And what we need to do is go in and hand encode, more or less. I mean, we can automate some of it, but all of these facts about reality. And we need to generate a bunch of what we called common sense tests. And philosophers are really good at thinking through this because they can think of, basic sentences, think of exceptions to those sentences. Um, uh, did a lot of like really foundational, novel, important things. I can't do the history full justice, but if you have folks who are interested in this at all, looking into the Psych project, I think is really cool. It has Doug has some good material out there as well. If you just search Doug Lennett, and he had one with I'm gonna forget his name now. The MIT podcaster guy, Lex Friedman, I think.
Oh,
That, like, if you want to get an overview, that's like classic Doug and gives you a lot of the important things. But yeah, that introduced me to ontology as a whole, and thinking about not just doing like a domain picture, but that our knowledge is reused all over the place, right? Um, one of the pushbacks I find in LRDF that maybe sets me apart from some other ontologists that have spent most of their time in LRDF, I'm not that interested in only building a domain model that looks at, say, like biology or something like that, because I know the knowledge that we have about biology borrows from a lot of more general knowledge that's reused, right? The fact that bigger things don't fit into smaller things is reused in all sorts of domains, right? Um, you can think of it almost as like the upper ontology versus domain ontology, but Psychor was the upper ontology for common sense.
Yeah, and that's a common concern of any ontologist is whether to adopt an existing ontology or to create one unique to your domain. But like you just said, and you talk, this sounds like a foundational thing in your practice, is that you do. Well, you mentioned, for example, you've adopted Dave McComb's idea of categories whenever you build an ontology, and that's sort of like. That's not, I guess that's not, I don't know if you wholesale adopt the gist ontology or just that practice out of that. Can you talk a little bit about that? Like, how is it just reusing upper ontologies, or are there practices and principles and concepts that you pluck from these other existing artifacts?
So yeah, I mean, my relationship with gist is that was the first upper ontology in OWL-RDF that I learned. And so it was like a safe space or something that I went back to. The metaphor I use a lot is, and I encourage anybody else who's doing this, if there's, don't reinvent the wheel. If there's an ontology out there that does what you want, right, kick the tires on a little bit, but like you should absolutely use it. What will probably happen, and what happened with me and Gist, is there are a lot of things I found wanting about Gist. I'm not trying to start a fight with them or something like that. But I viewed it as like I took that house as like a fixer upper, right? It was like, all right, I'm going to take that ontology, and then I'm going to start knocking down walls and moving things around and redoing the plumbing and stuff like that, right? But there's certain fixed points. Maybe I like the house's footprints, and then expand it. So that was sort of my starting point, and then it now somewhat, the ontology that I use somewhat resembles Gist. There are a few terms that I have in there that I'm like, all right, this is basically exactly what they meant by the similar term in Gist. I think Gist is more, it's designed to be flexible a little bit and sort of fit onto a number of different projects. And it's really important for Dave and the company to keep their ontology relatively light. He has this thought that if you have more than a certain number of classes or terms, then the human brain just can't grok it anymore, and so that it won't be used and effective. I disagree with that general philosophy. I think that it should be like way denser and more robust. But I think if we have the right hierarchical layering of things, then the top level classes should be relatively sparse. We don't want too many of them, but it can fan out and get really fine grained underneath that. Uh, so I have a much larger version of Gist, I guess. But then when you're talking about categories in specific, right? I just did a video on this, so it's fresh on my mind. Categories, I I don't love them metaphysically. It's not like I think this is an important way to view the world. Categories are almost more important because of the restrictions that you have in OWL. Uh, that's a bad turn of phrase. Not OWL restrictions, but like the limitations of an OWL framework, right? Is fundamentally it's a two-leveled system where we've got individuals and classes, and that's great if we're talking about you know like I've got dishes or something like that, and like my particular coffee cup is an instance of a dish or as an instance of mug. That's great, but there are lots of places where we want to use more than two levels, right? So I feel like periodicals are really maybe a little more tricky on this. So like we've got New York Times. This is a newspaper, might be the collection of all New York Times newspapers, and then we have like I might be tempted to say that, and then like today's edition of the paper might be an individual that's an instance of that, right? But then I have my own copy of today's paper, and that feels like an instance of today's paper, which is an instance of a New York Times. Wait, now I can't have that many levels of instances. And now we have a puzzle where it's like I've got two levels, but I want to put stuff in three levels or more. And you have two choices. Either we can go like keep the individuals, have classes, and then have meta classes. If you're thinking of sets that contain sets, or we can mush stuff down and say that we have individuals and we have some other individuals that categorize those individuals. And that's the category route. Is that instead of if I want to talk about, I think the W3C has an article on this or whatever, if people search it up for like punning, and you get that eagles are an endangered species, right? And you want to say, so eagle is an instance of endangered species, but eagle feels like the class of all the eagles. And so now I'm in this difficulty, right? You could make eagle a category, which is I'm just going to have a instance level version of eagle. And then I can use object properties, because that's the other driving force here, is that in OWL RDF, object properties are what we want to use to describe and deal with our data. And so there's this impetus to make the things that I want to talk about individuals rather than making them classes. Myself, I'm kind of cool leaving them as classes and just having annotation properties talk about things, but then I know that I'm kind of, in some sense, I'm misusing it, because annotation properties aren't supposed to be substantive. They're supposed to be just metadata about how I formed the class or something like that. It's not supposed to give me uh, uh, substantive modeling claims.
Well, that's so interesting, because like in any one domain, you're just going to have a bunch of stuff, and then getting it down to like, and I think Dave would say, well, let's get it down to a manageable number of classes. And this sounds like the way you handle it, it's like your individual practice decisions about how to do this. Like that decision, I think that decision you talked about in one of your videos to model an event as a subclass of a situation. I thought that was a really interesting modeling. Is that in that same the same category as what you were just talking about categories? Yeah.
So there's so many, like all these grouping words like category and class and object and thing and stuff like that. When you become an ontologist, they, in some sense, they lose all their meaning, or you have to like reorient yourself every time, because you're like, oh, that's not the thing we were talking about. They're like, you mean owl thing? You mean like the most general? You're like, no, it was just a random throwaway noun. That's what I wanted. So comes to thinking about events and situations. So categories, like I said, it's not super like philosophical or metaphysical. Maybe I think of them as labels or something, but it's largely it's a useful device in the OWL framework. When I think about events, I'm much more metaphysically committed to them. Events and situations, I think, are real parts of the worlds. They're things I see out there. They're things I want to describe. I want my model to match up with that. There's another piece that ties in to my history at Scicore. So the approach there for modeling events and situations was a Davidsonian approach. I feel like I maybe even just like talk about this is our Davidsonian model, and I don't say anything else about that in some of my YouTube videos, which may be confusing. But named after Donald Davidson, philosopher who has his own account for how we should think about events and things happening, about particulars and hanging off of each other. We were talking a little bit before this call. It's like, okay, I remember that, and I need to go back and read the paper to really say any more meaningful things. So apologies to Donald Davidson lovers out there that I'm not giving a good account of that. But essentially, the way that you can think about an event, the event itself is the Christmas tree, and then everything else gets hung off of it, right? So we're doing a podcast interview here, and then there are a bunch of role players within that podcast interview event. You can hang me off of it as the interviewee, and we can hang Larry off of it as the interviewer, and then we've got a particular time that this is happening, and place, or multiple places, since it's occurring, online in different, in both Europe and the United States. And so you've got this fundamental central object that then all of the other stuff is attached to. In an OWL RDF, those role-playing predicates are, I have a sort of super predicate that's like situation involves, and then I have sub-properties of that that attach the various sorts of roles that you might have. Something like done by is requires relating an agent to the events that is the doer of the event. And maybe we have more specific versions of done by, right? So it's like completed by, or started by, or etc. And not only do I pretty much like the metaphysical view of events as, this subclass of situation that's a Christmas tree that everything hangs off of it, it's very amenable to graph structure. Right? OWL RDF, one of the puzzles, right? If I want to say that, Casey does podcast, they're like, oh, great, there's my triple. Casey does podcast. And you're like, wait, but Larry does podcast. Wait, all right, podcast is the events. That's the thing that we're doing, and like all the things get related to it. That's what it's pushed towards. But one of the first approaches that some people do to events and activities is they say like Casey kicks ball or whatever, right, as my triple, and I want to say when that happens. Now, how do I do that? Like, what do I attach the time to? Like, I can't attach it to the property because that's just not the way OWL RDF works. It's not an LPG. Then I have to do like this RDF star or something, or a reification. And essentially, you can think of what's going on here as kind of like a reification. I have to think more about like what they're.
You know what?
They might be isomorphic, but they're pretty close.
I'll link to your video where you talk about the block, LeBron James's famous block, and with the 2016, I think, NBA Finals, because that was a great example of that. But you said a minute ago the word agent, and immediately I was like triggered. I was like, oh yeah, AI. We got to talk about AI. But also, that's also how I first found you. You did I can't remember how I came across. I think somebody shared it on LinkedIn, but you did a post about like, what is AI? And then you were kind of like, I don't know. But then you did elaborate, and you have a lot of good ideas about what it might be. But I'm wondering, that was like maybe a year ago or something. I'm just wondering how your thinking on AI has evolved, and especially in relation to like the relationship between the neural side, all the LLM, GPTs, conversational Gen AI kind of stuff, and then our knowledge representation stuff. Where's your thinking at these days?
Yeah. So the some spoilers for upcoming videos. Yeah, I've got the next couple there. I feel like I know what I want to say my answer to what AI is now, but I'm always someone, maybe this is the analytic philosopher in me, right? When we're starting something, like I ought to be able to define it or say what I'm talking about first. And my approach to defining AI is, well, we can start with some examples of it. And this is something else that I sort of borrow from methodology that we did in philosophy a lot. Like in epistemology, we know what it is to know something, right? Or at least we talk about knowing stuff. And so the first thing I do is like, okay, say some stuff that we know. I know I'm holding this cup. I know I'm in this room, etc. And then we try and come up with a theory of what knowledge is, such that it explains, makes sense of those things. Maybe we have to throw out some examples, but that's a good basis for us. And for AI, I'm going to start with, okay, well, what are some things that we're commonly calling AI? ChatGPT is AI. Maybe this camera, like auto-focusing on me to some extent, is AI, a number of things like that. Okay, what's a definition of it that works? Let's look historically. And the more that I've pushed on it, the more that I think it's wrong to try and define something as AI. Like, it's okay, like it's a fine pass for us to say, I'm going to call this thing AI. That's clearly the way we talk, and I'm not going to force us to change that. But I think it's probably better to think of AI as the discipline. It's the thing that we're studying, right? So the science of artificial intelligence is trying to create, non-biological minds or something like that. And then the scientists who do that, the people who research that, end up building a bunch of stuff. And the byproducts of that research we can call AI colloquially, but I don't think of those things as being AI themselves. And if you think of the parallel to this for science, right? Science is very hard to define. Like it's a classic, another philosophy of science, the classic definition problem. How do you describe like what's science versus pseudoscience? And it feels intuitive to everyone until you push to some difficult cases, and then you realize, well, like for a long time, they thought phrenology was science, and shaking an 8-ball or like reading tea leaves is science. Now we don't want to call that. How do you do it? How do you not? What's the line of demarcation? If you find yourself thinking, "Oh, it's obvious," please come solve the problem. Philosophers would love for you to solve that problem. It's harder than you think. Uh, but if we talk about science, right? So people who study a specific type of science, whether we want to say like, a material science or physics or whatever, we don't say the products that could be produced by that are science, right? Undoubtedly, someone studying material science, came in and helped, produce whatever like polymer goes together to make this toy that I'm holding. For those of you on the podcast, I'm holding a little squishy forklift. But so science, I wouldn't say, but see this I'm holding, this is science. Like, no, we'd say like the study of the sciences enable us to build this sort of thing, right? That's kind of how I feel about what people are calling AI. Like, is ChatGPT AI? No. I mean, you can say it if you want, but like those who are interested in creating non-human minds produced a thing, and it was this, and it was a tool that did these various sorts of things. I think that's important. One, because we should be clear about our concepts, and I think if you push anybody on what they mean by AI, you'll find out they're not very clear about their concepts. It almost always comes down, I think, to AI as something that either could be confused for a human or that could do something that a human might otherwise do, right? Well, like, look, I've got a door over there, and a human could stand in front of it and keep people from getting in. And before the invention of deadbolts, people would do that. And now we've got a deadbolt that does that. I don't want to call the deadbolt AI, but like it's doing a thing that an intelligent human otherwise might do, right? Like, yeah, we can come up with these cases that feels like kind of grotesque. They're not really AI, but maybe at some point in time, somebody like, why is this door closed and not opening, even though I'm pushing on it? Like there's some artificial person holding it closed for me. Like they could have said that until we figured out that how deadbolts worked and they were no longer so magical, right? And I think the same thing's going to happen with LLMs and other things along the way. A thermostat that senses the temperature and regulates the temperature of your house feels super smart, but now people are not probably calling that AI so much. We're not so mystified by it. And then eventually we'll be like, yeah, what LLMs are doing, they are taking a bunch of information, munging it together, and then spitting it back out at me. Hopefully in smart kinds of ways. The algorithms have, primed to be really helpful to me. But that's just another deadbolt or paperweight or something like that, in my view.
Nice. I wish we could have you moderating all of the hype coming out of Silicon Valley. Have a philosopher-approved version of it.
It's so frustrating, man. Because you're just like, okay, the people who are giving the hype are the people who are profiting a ton off of it, which is, this is again, logic and epistemology and rhetoric 101. Like, don't trust those people. Maybe some of them are right and some of them are reliable, but they have problematic biases and conflicts of interest. And then the other part that's really tough is, and I know you want to talk somewhat about sort of talking to business folks, and that's part of the target audience here, but you set ridiculous expectations, right? That AI will do these magical things. And it puts those of us, hopefully I'm in this camp that's not overhyping the industry, but thinks it does really cool things, puts you in a bind because you don't want to go to a potential client and be like, hey, this product, it's not as good as you think. Like, that's not a compelling sales pitch. But at the same time, you can't be like, hey, look at this product, it's better than anything you've heard. You're like, no, I can't cash that check. I mean, I'll cash their checks until they realize I can't cash the metaphorical check of getting the product to do the things. And so it's not magic. But it can do some awesome stuff. Like you've got to find that balance, and it's really true.
Yeah, and I think we're all looking for that.
If there is another AI winter, if there is an AI winter, it's going to come another one. It's going to come from this ridiculous overhype of LLMs and what we can expect them to do. and then the layoffs associated with it, and then we're going to have to backfill for those people if those products don't do what we need them to do. So it's going to be interesting.
It is. And, you reminded me, there's a number of reasons we need to check back in like a year or so. Like, we're running close on time, so I want to wrap things up. But you just mentioned rhetoric, another aspect of philosophy that's so relevant to like the conversational nature of AI. There's probably all kinds of stuff there. The business stuff, we can talk about that more later. But right now, I want to make sure before we wrap up, is there anything last you want to make sure we mention, or anything you want to revisit from the conversation before we wrap up today?
Man, we've hit a bunch of different things. I've rambled a lot. Apologies. I guess that's just sort of my style. I hope folks get from this that there are a bunch of interesting like philosophical tie-ins to ontology, and that if we think clearly about things and try and build our models in ways that reflect the way that the world works, with the constraints that are given to us by OWL RDF, you can do some cool stuff. There's a lot of further conversations I want to have with you, but not a specific thing that jumps in here. I guess one thing that came up a few times in my head as we were going over that I should mention: don't forget that the thing that we're building is a model. And when I describe a model is a simplification of reality, right? So one objection I could hear someone having when I talked about, well, you're restricted when you build stuff in OWL because you've got 2 levels. You're like, okay, well, that's an impoverished model, and that's a problem. Like, we need the more robust one. And that was definitely part of the Psych project, is that it wanted put everything in it, as many intricacies as you could, and that does some really cool stuff. But just like whenever you're building a model, it has to be a simplification. We have the real thing. It's the world. It's out there. And our model has to be, okay, and here are some relevant details we want to abstract away from that we can reuse. And the job of an ontologist is to pick, well, what's the right level of abstraction for that, so that it's manageable and good and workable, and but that we didn't lose too much information, because if we lose too much information, then we can't prove the things that we need to be able to prove. And if you're going back to that sort of the debate we had with Dave McComb, who's not here, about how many terms to have in the ontology, I think that's the right lens to view that from, if you're trying to figure out, okay, maybe a more robust model that has got more terms in it is just worse because it's less usable by people. It's you're painting the steering wheel in a little toy car where the goal of the car was to generate wind resistance, and then who cares what color the steering wheel is? That doesn't factor into it, right? So make sure the details you're providing are the details that you want to use.
Yeah, that reminds me. I do a lot of talks about modeling, and I always include the George Box quote: "All models are wrong, but some models are useful."
Yes.
Yeah,
right.
which is way too true. Hey, Casey, one very last thing. If folks want to connect with you or follow you, what's the best place to find you? One.
Yeah. So the best place to find me, I think, is just probably on LinkedIn. You can look me up on my YouTube channel. This is a thing that I'm trying to figure out. Maybe I'll send you a link later if there's something put in the description. But I've had a few people reach out to me from the YouTube channel via LinkedIn, and like, it's kind of annoying because you've got to go through get a pro account to message somebody. So I need to get an anonymous email account or something. I don't want to just I'm not going to put my cell phone number up. I got to figure out the right answer. But yeah, go look up Ontology Explained on YouTube, and you'll find me there. Yeah.
Okay. And I'll put your LinkedIn profile and your YouTube channel in there so folks can find your ultimate email solution there, I'm sure. Yeah. Well, thanks so much, Casey. This is a really fun conversation.
Oh, pleasure is mine. Yeah, hopefully we can do another one sometime. Great to meet you.
For show notes and to sign up for our newsletter, visit our website at knowledgegraphinsights.com, and please rate and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Thank you for listening.